3 days beneath the burning sun should have been enough. That was the sentence. No executioner, no blade, no mercy. Just an ancient wooden cross in the middle of a desert where nothing survived for long. The men who left him there never looked back. They didn't need to. The vultures would finish what they had started. By the second day, they were already circling overhead. By the third, they stopped waiting. One landed on the cross. Another stepped through the bones scattered beneath his feet. Conan couldn't swing a sword, couldn't run, couldn't even raise an arm to drive them away. The desert had taken everything from him, except one thing, his will. And before the sun finally disappeared beyond the dunes, something happened on that cross that no one could have imagined. Not the vultures, not the men who condemned him, not even Conan himself, but to understand how the greatest warrior of the Hyborian Age ended up nailed beneath an endless sky. We have to go back to the day he realized his queen was no longer the woman she claimed to be. The first thing Conan noticed wasn't the soldiers. It was the silence. For months, Queen Taramis had ruled Khura'in with wisdom. The market stayed open late into the night. Farmers spoke freely in the streets. Even the palace guards laughed when their shifts ended. Then, almost overnight, everything changed. The gates closed before sunset. People whispered instead of speaking. Merchants disappeared without explanation. Anyone who questioned the new orders was never seen again. Most believed the queen had simply become harder after facing difficult times. Conan believed something else. He had crossed kingdoms ruled by mad kings, thieves wearing crowns, and priests who hid daggers beneath their robes. He knew that power changed people, but this wasn't change. This felt wrong. The woman sitting on Khura'in's throne looked exactly like Queen Taramis. She wore the same robes, spoke with the same voice, even smiled the same way. Yet every instinct Conan possessed told him he was standing before a stranger. He couldn't explain it, not with words. A hesitation before answering. Eyes that studied people as if they were prey. Orders that demanded fear instead of loyalty. Tiny details no one else noticed, but Conan noticed everything. When the queen ordered an entire village burned because taxes arrived late, Conan refused. When she demanded innocent prisoners be executed without trial, he argued in front of her own officers. The throne room became silent. The queen looked at him for several seconds. Then she smiled, not with kindness, with satisfaction, as though she had been waiting for that exact moment. "You refuse your queen?" she asked calmly. Conan's hand rested on the hilt of his sword. "I refuse whoever is pretending to be her." The room exploded. Hidden doors burst open. Dozens of soldiers rushed from behind the pillars. Archers appeared above the balconies. It had never been a conversation. It had always been a trap. Conan's sword flashed through the air before the first soldier reached him. Steel shattered. Blood struck the marble floor. A second man fell. Then a third. Every step toward the exit cost another enemy, but more kept coming. Spears trapped his movements. Shields boxed him in. A weighted net crashed over his shoulders before he could cut it apart. He ripped through the ropes. Too late. Iron chains wrapped around his arms. Clubs struck the back of his head. One blow, then another. His knees finally touched the floor. The last thing Conan saw before darkness swallowed him was the queen's face, still smiling. Not with victory, with relief. because the only man who had recognized her deception would never speak again. When Conan opened his eyes, the palace was gone. His armor had been stripped away. His sword had vanished. Heavy iron shackles bit into his wrists as a caravan crossed endless dunes beneath a merciless sun. Ahead, rising from the sea of sand, stood a massive wooden cross, and for the first time in many years, Conan understood that his enemies had no intention of killing him quickly. The caravan stopped without warning. No city stood beyond the dunes, no fortress, no prison, nothing but an endless ocean of sand stretching toward the horizon, broken only by a single structure rising from the earth like the skeleton of a forgotten giant. The cross. It towered above the desert, its weathered beams blackened by years beneath the relentless sun. Iron rings had been driven deep into the wood, stained dark by blood that countless storms had failed to wash away. Conan needed no explanation. Men had died here before him. Many men. The soldiers dragged him through the burning sand until his knees carved long trails behind him. Every movement filled his wounds with grit. The iron around his wrists had already peeled away layers of skin during the journey, but no one cared. This place had been built for suffering, not justice. One of the captains stepped forward carrying a hammer. Another held thick iron spikes. Only then did Conan understand. They weren't simply leaving him to die. They intended to make sure he could never leave. Without a word, they forced his arms against the rough timber. The first spike pierced his wrist. The sound echoed across the empty desert. Not a scream, not a cry, just iron splitting flesh before burying itself deep into ancient wood. Pain exploded through his arm like fire racing beneath his skin. Another spike followed. Then chains wrapped around his forearms and chest, tightening until breathing itself became difficult. His ankles were bound separately, forcing his body to bear its own weight. Every passing minute became torture. Every breath stretched muscles already beginning to tear. The captain stepped closer, wiping sweat from his forehead as he admired his work. "You'll beg before sunset?" Conan slowly raised his eyes. "I've seen stronger men than you beg for less." The captain laughed. "So have I." He struck Conan across the face with the hammer. Blood ran down the barbarian's beard before disappearing into the dry wood beneath him. The soldiers laughed. One by one, they climbed onto their horses. Nobody looked back. The desert itself would finish the execution. Within minutes, the only sound left was the wind. It whispered through the empty dunes like voices speaking a language older than kingdoms. The heat arrived almost immediately. Without movement, the sun became something alive. It settled over Conan's skin with unbearable weight. His shoulders burned first, then his chest, his face. The wood beneath him grew so hot it scorched his back through what little clothing remained. Sweat poured from every wound. Then it stopped. The desert stole even that. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time no longer existed beneath that sky. The sun refused to move. Every attempt to shift his weight only drove the iron deeper into his wrists. His fingers slowly lost sensation. His lips cracked open. His tongue felt thick inside his mouth. The thirst came long before hunger. It wasn't ordinary thirst. It was something far worse. Each breath dried his throat until swallowing became impossible. He searched the horizon again and again. Nothing. No riders. No clouds, no mercy. only shimmering waves of heat dancing above the sand, creating lakes that vanished every time he focused on them. By afternoon, the first visitor arrived, a single black shape circling high overhead. Conan watched it complete one slow circle. Then another, its wings barely moved. It wasn't hunting. It was waiting. Before long, a second bird joined it. Then a third. They drifted silently against the burning sky, patient, certain. The Barbarian followed them with his eyes, but refused to lower his head. Predators understood weakness. He would not show them any. As the sun finally began sinking toward the horizon, the temperature changed with frightening speed. The burning air disappeared. Cold replaced it. A desert night carried no mercy either. His sweat-soaked skin chilled instantly. Every wound stiffened. His muscles cramped from remaining in the same position for so many endless hours. Darkness spread across the dunes. The vultures vanished. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Conan heard it. A faint scraping sound, soft, slow, moving through the sand below him. He looked down. A thick desert snake emerged from beneath a sun-bleached skull, half buried in the dunes. Its scales reflected the last light of the dying sun. Its tongue flickered through the air as it searched for warmth. It slid across the sand without hurry, closer, closer, until it reached the base of the cross. Then it began climbing. The snake remained coiled around the wooden beam for several long seconds, its scales absorbing the last warmth left by the dying sun. Conan could feel its body only inches from his leg, close enough that a single strike would sink venom into flesh already weakened by exhaustion. Every instinct told him to move, but experience had kept him alive far longer than strength ever had. He knew that many predators attacked only when they sensed panic. As long as he remained still, the snake had no reason to waste its venom. Time crawled forward until the serpent finally slipped away, disappearing into the darkness between the dunes. Conan watched it vanish, but the relief lasted only a moment. The desert had already taught him its first lesson. Every danger that left would eventually be replaced by another. Night spread across the endless sea of sand with astonishing speed. The heat that had burned his skin throughout the day vanished almost instantly, replaced by a freezing wind that swept across the open desert. His sweat-soaked body began to shiver uncontrollably. Muscles that had been stretched for hours tightened until every joint felt as though it were being pulled apart. He could neither stand nor rest. Every position was agony because there was no position at all. The iron spikes held him exactly where his enemies wanted him, forcing his own weight to tear at his shoulders with every passing minute. Sleep became impossible. Whenever exhaustion closed his eyes, another stab of pain shot through his wrists or shoulders, forcing him awake again. His body desperately wanted rest, but the cross denied him even that small mercy. The hours blended together until he could no longer tell whether he had been there for one night or several. The silence slowly began to change. At first it was only the wind moving across the dunes, but soon other sounds crept into his thoughts. He heard water flowing somewhere beyond the horizon. It sounded distant, almost impossible. Yet every passing moment made it seem more real. He could almost hear a river rushing over smooth stones. Then came the scent of pine trees, fresh rain, and cold mountain air. His mind had returned to Cimmeria. For a brief moment he was no longer hanging above the desert. He was climbing frozen cliffs as a young warrior, feeling snow beneath his boots while icy streams rushed beside him. He remembered kneeling beside those rivers without giving a single thought to how precious clean water truly was. Back then, thirst had been something that disappeared within seconds. Now it had become a monster. His tongue pressed painfully against the roof of his mouth. His lips had split so deeply that dried blood cracked each time he tried to swallow. Every breath scraped his throat like sandpaper, and even the smallest movement stole more moisture from his body. The illusion collapsed as quickly as it had appeared. The forest disappeared. The river vanished. Only endless sand remained beneath the stars. Conan understood exactly what was happening. The desert was beginning to attack his mind. He had seen soldiers lose themselves to thirst before. Strong men had followed imaginary lakes until they collapsed. Others had spoken with people who had died years earlier. The greatest danger was not believing the visions. The greatest danger was wanting them to be real. When dawn finally arrived, it brought no comfort. The first rays of sunlight crept across the dunes, and within minutes the freezing air was replaced by unbearable heat. The wooden cross, chilled throughout the night, rapidly became an oven beneath his back. The metal driven through his wrists grew hotter with every passing hour, until the iron itself seemed ready to burn his flesh. Conan could already feel his strength fading. His fingers no longer responded the way they should. His shoulders had gone almost completely numb, yet every attempt to move reminded him that pain was still waiting beneath the numbness. His breathing had become slower, not because he wanted to conserve energy, but because his body was beginning to fail. It was then that he noticed movement above him. The vultures had returned. Unlike the day before, they did not remain high in the sky. One after another they descended toward the desert floor, landing at different distances around the cross. None of them rushed, none of them showed fear. They behaved with the calm confidence of creatures that had witnessed this same execution many times before. Conan counted them without moving his head. 1, then 3, then 5. Before long there were 7 vultures standing silently around him, their dark eyes never leaving the man bound to the cross. They seemed almost statues carved from black stone, waiting for time to finish what the soldiers had begun. Most men would have seen only hungry birds. Conan saw something else. He noticed that one of them always moved first. It was larger than the others, with torn feathers covering one side of its neck and scars across its beak from countless fights. Whenever it stepped forward, the others followed. The others followed. Whenever it stopped, the circle stopped with it. Even now, while his body slowly surrendered to the desert, Conan's mind continued doing what had kept him alive throughout his entire life. He watched. He studied. He searched for patterns that everyone else ignored. The great vulture took another careful step across the sand before opening its enormous wings. Instead of climbing back into the sky, it glided silently toward the cross and landed on one of the heavy beams only a few feet from Conan's face. The bird tilted its head from one side to the other, studying him with complete confidence. It believed the warrior no longer had the strength to fight, and for the first time since the execution began, Conan allowed the vulture to keep believing exactly that. The great vulture remained on the cross, watching Conan with the quiet confidence of a creature that had learned one simple truth about the desert. Everything died eventually. It had watched horses collapse beneath the sun. It had watched caravans disappear into the dunes. It had watched men stronger than Conan surrender to thirst before the third sunrise. As far as the bird was concerned, this was simply another meal waiting to happen. Conan refused to meet its patience with desperation. His breathing remained slow and deliberate. Every movement cost him strength he could no longer replace, so he allowed his body to become almost motionless. The bird interpreted that stillness as weakness, exactly as he hoped it would. The hours passed beneath an unforgiving sky. The heat became almost impossible to describe. It no longer felt as though the sun was shining above him. It felt as though he had been locked inside a furnace where every breath carried fire instead of air. The rough timber behind his back burned against his skin, while the iron spikes holding his wrists absorbed the sunlight until they felt hot enough to brand flesh. His vision began to blur. The horizon twisted like waves across the sand, making distant dunes appear to float. The world itself seemed to bend beneath the relentless heat. More than once Conan thought he saw riders approaching from the east, only to realize they were nothing more than shimmering columns of hot air dancing above the desert floor. Thirst had become far more dangerous than pain. Pain kept a man awake. Thirst slowly stole his ability to think. His tongue had swollen so badly that swallowing became almost impossible. Every breath scraped against the inside of his throat until it felt raw. Even blinking seemed to require effort now, and his eyelids grew heavier with every passing hour. The vultures noticed. There were no longer 7. Now there were 11. Some stood beneath the cross, while others hopped across scattered bones left by executions long forgotten. They never argued. They never rushed toward him. Experience had taught them that impatience only wasted energy. The dessert always delivered its dead. The large vulture remained closest. Its black eyes never left Conan's face. It tilted its head from time to time, almost as if measuring the distance between life and death. Every few minutes it opened its wings, flapped them once, then settled again without taking flight. Conan watched every movement. He had spent his entire life studying enemies before fighting them. Whether the enemy carried a sword, claws, or feathers made very little difference. Every living creature repeated patterns. Every hunter eventually revealed a habit. Survival often belonged to the one who noticed those habits first. The bird was growing bolder. Each time it moved, it landed slightly closer than before. The others copied its behavior. By late afternoon, the circle around the cross had tightened considerably. Several vultures now stood close enough that Conan could hear their claws scraping softly against small stones buried beneath the sand. None of them attacked, not yet. They were waiting for permission. That permission would come from the oldest bird. The leader would always take the first bite. Only then would the rest join the feast. Conan remembered old hunters in Cimmeria explaining the behavior of wolves during winter. The strongest animal always tested the prey first. If there was danger, only one wolf was lost. If there was no resistance, the entire pack moved together. The desert followed the same law. Different predators, the same instinct. The sun continued its slow journey across the sky. Conan could no longer feel several fingers on his left hand. His shoulders had become completely numb, yet the numbness frightened him more than the pain ever had. It meant his body was beginning to surrender. He lowered his eyes for the first time since sunrise and noticed something he had overlooked before. The wood beneath his wrists had changed. Hours of struggling during the first day had stained the old timber with fresh blood. The constant pressure of the iron spike had widened the hole slightly, crushing dry fibers that had already weakened after years beneath the desert sun. It wasn't much. Most men would never have noticed. Conan did. He stopped pulling against the restraints altogether. Instead, he remained perfectly still, allowing the full weight of his body to hang naturally from the spikes. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Another hour slipped away. Still nothing. But Conan wasn't expecting immediate results. He wasn't trying to overpower the cross. He was studying it. Ancient wood behaved differently from fresh timber. Heat expanded it during the day. Cold tightened it at night. Dry fibers cracked under constant pressure, even when the change was too small for ordinary eyes to notice. If the cross had stood there for decades, then time had already begun destroying it long before he arrived. For the first time since the soldiers had abandoned him, Conan stopped thinking about surviving the desert. He began thinking about surviving the cross itself. The great vulture suddenly spread its wings again. This time it did not stop halfway. It hopped once along the wooden beam before landing directly beside Conan's shoulder. The distance between them had become so small that Conan could hear the bird breathing. The hooked beak moved slowly toward the blood drying across his skin. The vulture hesitated only for an instant. Then it stretched its neck forward, convinced the warrior no longer possessed the strength to resist. Conan did not move, not because he lacked the strength, because he was waiting for the exact moment when the bird would stop being cautious and start believing it had already won. The vulture lowered its head until its hooked beak hovered only inches from Conan's shoulder. It studied him without fear, convinced the man hanging before it had already crossed the invisible line between life and death. Around the base of the cross, the rest of the flock remained perfectly still. They trusted the oldest bird to decide when the feast could begin. Conan barely breathed. Every instinct inside him urged him to strike before the bird came any closer, but instinct alone had never kept him alive. Patience had. During his years as a thief, mercenary, pirate, and king, he had learned that the right moment was often worth more than the strongest weapon. The vulture leaned forward again. Its beak touched the dried blood covering Conan's shoulder. It gave a cautious peck. The pain shot through his body like a blade driven into an open wound, but he did not react. His jaw tightened until his teeth felt ready to crack, yet he refused to give the bird what it expected. If it believed he still possessed enough strength to fight, it would retreat. The bird pecked again. This time it stayed longer, tearing away a small piece of dried flesh before lifting its head. The flock did not move. Every pair of black eyes remained fixed on the leader. Conan understood exactly what they were waiting for. Once the oldest bird decided the prey was harmless, the others would rush forward together. If that happened, the cross would become his grave within minutes. The third attack came without hesitation. The hooked beak reached toward his neck. That was the moment Conan had been waiting for. His head exploded forward with every ounce of strength remaining in his body. Instead of trying to strike the bird with his hands, which remained pinned by iron, he drove his forehead directly into the side of its skull. The impact echoed across the empty desert. The vulture shrieked in surprise as its wings exploded open, beating wildly against Conan's face. Feathers filled the air while the entire flock scattered in every direction, startled by the sudden violence. The great bird struggled desperately to regain balance. Its claws scraped across the wooden beam. One talon caught in the chain wrapped around Conan's forearm. The bird panicked. It twisted violently, trying to pull free. Conan saw his opportunity. Ignoring the agony ripping through both shoulders, he rotated his arm with all the strength he still possessed. The frightened vulture pulled in the opposite direction. For a heartbeat, man and beast fought against each other. Then the ancient wood answered first. A sharp cracking sound echoed beneath Conan's wrist. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but Conan felt it immediately. The timber surrounding the iron spike had shifted, only slightly, barely the width of a fingernail. Yet after 2 days of constant pressure, burning heat, freezing nights, and the desperate weight of his own body, the dry wood had finally begun to split. The terrified bird tore itself free and vanished into the sky, leaving several dark feathers drifting slowly toward the sand below. The rest of the flock continued circling overhead once more, screaming angrily as though warning one another that the dying man was still capable of fighting. Conan ignored them. His entire attention focused on the tiny crack surrounding the spike driven through his wrist. Most men would have called it meaningless. He saw possibility. The crack had not appeared because of luck. It had appeared because old wood could only endure so much punishment before giving way. The desert itself had been helping him without knowing it. The brutal heat expanded the timber every day. The freezing nights contracted it again. His own weight had done the rest. For nearly 3 days the cross had been fighting against time just as much as Conan had. Now the first weakness had revealed itself. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to think despite the pounding inside his skull. If he pulled too hard now, the wood might hold. If he exhausted the little strength he had left, there would be no second attempt. Everything depended on choosing the perfect moment. The sun slowly drifted toward the western horizon. As the heat began fading, the ancient timber released soft creaks that only someone listening carefully could hear. Every change in temperature made the old beams complain beneath the enormous strain. Conan smiled for the first time since his capture. It wasn't the smile of a man who believed he had escaped. It was the smile of someone who had finally discovered that his prison was not as invincible as it appeared. The desert had taken his sword. It had taken his strength. It had taken almost every drop of water inside his body. But it had also been destroying the cross hour after hour, without anyone noticing. The soldiers who condemned him believed they had left him hanging from an unbreakable execution post. They had never considered that the oldest enemy in the world was neither steel nor flesh. It was time. As darkness slowly approached once again, the temperature began falling exactly as it had the previous night. Conan lowered his breathing until it became almost imperceptible, conserving every fragment of strength that remained inside him. He knew the next night would decide everything. If the wood failed before his body did, he still had a chance. If his body surrendered first, the vultures would not have to wait for another sunrise. The sun disappeared behind the western dunes for the 3rd time. Conan watched the last light fade across the desert, while the air slowly changed once again. The burning heat that had tortured him throughout the day began to leave the old wooden beams, and with every passing minute the cross answered with faint groans. The sound was almost impossible to hear, but Conan had been listening to it since the previous evening. Wood was alive. Not like flesh, but alive enough to expand beneath the sun and contract beneath the cold. For 3 days the execution post had endured the same punishment as the man nailed to it. The difference was that no one had expected the cross to weaken. His enemies had trusted the desert. Conan trusted time. He closed his eyes and slowed his breathing until every movement inside his chest became almost imperceptible. His body begged him to rest, yet his mind refused to surrender. Every heartbeat reminded him that he possessed only one opportunity. If he failed now, the fourth sunrise would belong to the vultures. The cold arrived quickly. The timber beneath his wrists began shrinking almost imperceptibly as the temperature dropped. Tiny cracks spread through the dry grain with soft, snapping sounds that would have meant nothing to another man. To Conan, they sounded like hope. He did not pull immediately. Patience had brought him this far. He waited. Minute after minute passed while the desert became silent again. Even the vultures had retreated to the surrounding rocks to avoid the freezing wind. They believed the prisoner would still be waiting when daylight returned. Conan intended to disappoint them. He slowly shifted the weight of his body. Pain exploded through both shoulders. His vision blurred instantly, but he refused to stop. Nothing happened. The spike remained buried inside the timber. He relaxed again. Another long minute passed. He shifted his weight a second time, this time twisting his wrist instead of simply pulling against the iron. A dry crack answered from somewhere inside the beam. It was barely audible, but it was real. Conan repeated the movement. Again, then again. Every attempt tore fresh blood from his wrist, yet each movement widened the damaged fibers surrounding the spike. The cross resisted stubbornly, but it was no longer unbreakable. The execution post had begun losing the same battle as the man hanging upon it. Conan rested once more. His strength was disappearing rapidly. He could feel darkness pressing against the edges of his vision, urging him to close his eyes forever. More than once his body tried to surrender without asking permission. Each time he forced himself awake. He remembered the false queen smiling as he was condemned. He remembered the soldiers laughing while they hammered iron through his flesh. He remembered the captain promising that he would beg before sunset. That memory became stronger than pain. Conan drew one deep breath, then another. Finally, he threw the full weight of his body downward while twisting his shoulder, with every fragment of strength still living inside him. The beam answered with a violent crack. For one terrifying instant, nothing changed. Then the ancient wood split. The iron spike tore free, carrying with it a fist-sized fragment of rotten timber. Conan nearly collapsed. His right arm fell uselessly against his side, unable to move after days pinned above his head. Agony rushed through muscles that had forgotten how to exist. He almost blacked out. Almost. Instead, he bit down so hard that blood filled his mouth and forced himself to remain conscious. One arm was free. That meant nothing unless the rest of his body followed. His hand trembled uncontrollably as he reached toward the chain binding his chest. His fingers barely obeyed him. They felt swollen, numb, and unfamiliar, as though they belonged to another man. Even so, they worked, slowly, painfully. He found the iron pin securing the chain and pulled with everything he had left. It refused to move. He tried again. Still nothing. His breathing became ragged. The effort drained what little strength remained inside him. Then he remembered the broken spike still lodged inside the piece of timber hanging from his wrist. The jagged iron protruded just enough. enough to become a tool. Conan pressed the rough edge against the leather binding his chest and began sawing back and forth with slow, deliberate movements. Every motion scraped torn flesh. Every motion reopened wounds that had barely stopped bleeding. The leather resisted. Then, little by little, individual fibers began snapping. The first strap gave way. His chest expanded for the first time in 3 days. He inhaled so deeply that the cold night air burned his lungs. The second binding broke soon after. Without its support, the full weight of his body shifted downward, placing unbearable pressure on the remaining spikes. Conan cried out, despite himself. It was not a scream of fear. It was the sound of muscles tearing under impossible strain. He wrapped his free hand around the spike, pinning his left wrist, and pulled until his vision turned white. The damaged timber cracked once more. Not enough, he pulled again. His knees buckled. Blood streamed down the beam. The cross groaned beneath the strain. One final effort remained. Conan planted both feet against the upright beam, clenched his jaw, and threw every ounce of strength he still possessed into a single violent movement. The old timber exploded apart. His body crashed into the cold sand below. For several long moments he did not move. He simply lay there beneath the stars, unable to tell whether he was alive or dead. Every bone ached. Every breath hurt. Blood soaked the sand beneath his wrists, and even lifting his head seemed beyond his strength. Then he heard the sound that finally forced him back to reality. Heavy wings. The vultures had seen him fall. They were already gliding silently through the darkness, convinced that their feast had finally begun. They had waited 3 endless days for the man on the cross to die. What they did not understand was that for the first time since the execution began, Conan was no longer trapped. The desert greeted the riders with the same lifeless silence it had offered 3 days earlier. Nothing had changed. The dunes still stretched endlessly beneath the morning sun. The wind still carried sand across the old execution ground. The great wooden cross still stood where it had always stood, casting its lonely shadow over a field scattered with skulls and broken bones. The captain rode at the front of the column without urgency. He had returned for only one reason, not to rescue, not confirm, only to make certain that the desert had completed its work. He expected little more than a skeleton picked clean by vultures. Instead, the birds were nowhere to be seen. His horse slowed on its own. The captain frowned. The closer they approached, the stranger the place became. The sand surrounding the cross was disturbed. Deep marks crossed the ground in several directions. Black feathers lay scattered everywhere, carried lazily by the wind. One soldier climbed down from his horse and walked cautiously toward the execution post. His expression changed before he spoke. "There's blood." The captain dismounted. He examined the massive beam where Conan had been nailed. The spikes were still there. One remained buried deep inside the timber. Another hung from a shattered piece of ancient wood. The chains still dangled from the cross, swaying gently in the breeze. But the man who had been condemned was gone. No body lay beneath the execution post. No bones, no torn flesh, nothing. Only dried blood soaked into the weathered timber. The captain slowly turned in a full circle. His eyes searched every dune surrounding the execution ground. The desert was empty. One of the younger soldiers forced a nervous laugh. He couldn't have survived. Nobody answered. Another man pointed toward the sand several yards away. There, They all looked. Footprints, bare feet, unsteady, deeply pressed into the sand, as though every step had demanded the last strength remaining inside the man who made them. The tracks disappeared between the dunes, heading west. The captain knelt beside them. He placed one hand inside the nearest footprint. The edges had already begun softening beneath the wind, but they were still visible enough to tell the story. Someone had walked away from the cross. Someone who should have been dead. One of the soldiers swallowed hard. "We should follow him." The captain remained silent. His eyes moved from the tracks to the broken cross, then toward the endless desert beyond. He had spent enough years around warriors to understand something the younger men did not. Anyone capable of surviving 3 days nailed beneath the burning sun was no longer ordinary prey. He slowly stood. No, the soldiers stared at him in disbelief. "We outnumber him." The captain looked once more toward the distant dunes. "No," his voice remained calm. "We outnumbered him before." Silence settled over the execution ground. No one argued, because every man present remembered exactly how many soldiers it had taken to bring Conan down inside the palace. And every one of them understood the same terrifying truth. That had happened before the desert, before the thirst, before the vultures, before 3 days of suffering that should have broken any living man. The captain climbed back onto his horse. "Leave the cross exactly as it is." One soldier frowned. "Why?" The captain did not answer immediately. His eyes lingered on the empty execution post one final time. "Because one day another fool will ask whether Conan truly escaped this place." He turned his horse toward the horizon. "When that happens, let them come here and see the broken wood for themselves." The riders disappeared into the sea of sand, leaving the execution ground exactly as they had found it. The wind continued blowing across the ancient cross. The chains still swayed. The broken spikes still remained embedded in the weathered timber. To any traveler crossing that forgotten desert, it looked like nothing more than another place where a condemned man had died. Only the desert knew the truth. It had taken Conan's sword. It had taken his strength. It had taken nearly every drop of blood and water his body possessed. But even the oldest desert in the world had failed to take the one thing no enemy had ever managed to conquer: his will to survive. And that is why, across the Hyborian Age, warriors did not tell this story because Conan escaped across. They told it because they finally understood something far more frightening. If the desert itself could not kill Conan, they never would.